My boyfriend Mark and I picked up his 8-year-old son Aaron from religious school a few Sundays ago. Third graders, dressed up nicely for their first day of class, streamed out in all directions. When we asked him, "What did you do at school?" his reaction surprised us. It was so positive. He said, "We wrote our own rules for the classroom." I'm sure many of you have tried this exercise before, either as a teacher or a student. Did it work? Did the students write appropriate rules? I've seen students come up with more stringent rules than anything that I would ever choose from them, from the top down. More importantly, did the students feel more ownership over their classroom experience? Aaron isn't yet in that stage where he can generalize his needs to an abstract principle. For example, setting the table will always take a backseat to playing a computer game. But after his first day of religious school, why would Aaron be so excited to legislate these rules, which essentially curb his own behavior? In Genesis 8:21, God says, "The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth." What does that seem to mean? Heart is evil, lev ra. People are instinctively selfish. They hurt others. To put it into God's terms, people do not act with justice and righteousness. People break God's laws. But this verse says something different. It says people's hearts are evil from when they're young, which is a harsh portrayal of human nature. It's kind of a Lord of the Flies image. Yet 8 verses later, in 9:6, God says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, through man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God he made man." So even though God has just gotten done telling us all about human limitations, now God is clearly putting humanity in charge of ourselves, even giving us the authority to enact capital punishment. So why is God telling us to do this very serious thing that we're probably not ready for? Let's return to Aaron's first day of religious school, writing those classroom rules. Aaron's teacher had probably read Lord of the Flies herself. She surely was familiar with third graders, because instead of just beginning by having them suggest their own rules and voting, which is a huge responsibility at any age, she instead decided to start the exercise by handing out a worksheet about values. The students read examples of classroom values like supporting one another, being fair, and they ranked how important each was to him or her in relation to the others. And these values in print planted a seed for the classroom rules. They gave the students a framework to build on when they went to build their rules later. God, too, is a religious school teacher. God, too, gives humanity a values exercise before expecting us to create our own court system. The Nevi'im, the prophets, give voice to the downtrodden of society and demand protection from many who are powerless, including widows, orphans, and strangers. Our Western legal system is based on a value system highly influenced by the biblical prophets as well as the ethical mitzvot of the Torah. God, our religious school teacher, also gave humanity a Torah full of role models to learn from. For example, Abraham's impassioned plea for justice on behalf of the innocent of Sodom and Gomorrah, arguing his case with God himself. It's an important model for the public defender role. So if we return to the challenge of these two verses together, so close to one another, and their inconsistency, how can a judge rely on his judgment if the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth? Let's go back to the third line of our verse to look for clues. Whoever sheds the blood of man, through man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Who exactly is created in God's image according to this verse? I think the plain pshat reading is that the person who's been killed is in God's image, and that is why justice is required. But one can also read this verse as emphasizing the second line. Whoever sheds the blood of man, through man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Meaning, the one who is the judge, too, is B'Tselem Elohim. With practice and education, she can find the quality of justice and righteousness within herself, which is planted there by God. And this quality allows each of us to recreate God's just actions in the world. It allows each of us to hear God's voice from within, discerning right from wrong. With this instinct for good, we can balance out our lev ra, or even overpower it. but it's a process, and we need education about values to wake that mirrored image of God inside. In Genesis and then in Exodus, God is a religious teacher. Israelite leaders make mistakes in judgment and values and then learn by doing, by living God's revelation, becoming more confident in their own leadership. The people also take part in this learning process, learning to curb themselves. They learn to follow their leader's example and God's commandments, becoming a righteous people. Even in Aaron's third grade classroom, his teacher knows her students need to be given a chance to practice making the ethical choices. And Aaron can start with the small actions and judgments about classroom rules, for example, and then build toward those of greater importance, slowly replacing a lev ra with the values of our Jewish community. In Genesis, God still has hope that these youthful humans will one day learn to suppress their lev ra, whose base aspects of their nature are within. God believes that his people Israel will learn to become righteous people, worthy of God's name. Eventually, even with their ongoing lapses in holiness, they begin to develop. They begin to exemplify the Tselem Elohim placed in them from the beginning. One day, Mark will have to let his son Aaron out into the world to make choices on behalf of himself and others. Aaron is now being dragged to the synagogue's religious school, kicking and scowling and wearing basketball shorts instead of khakis like the other students, but they're good parents. Yet one day Aaron may be president of that synagogue. I don't know how the transformation will occur, but I know his religious school teacher is doing her part to assist him in the journey.